With my next Disney trip a mere hours away at the time of recording, I thought it'd be nice to take a look at all the stuff that Walt Disney himself invented or thought of that we see in theme parks throughout the world today. Welcome to Factor Nostalgia, where we discuss everything theme park then, now, and when. I'm your host, Sarah, and as I said, so this week, as you're listening to this, if you're listening to this as it comes out, I will be on a trip to Disneyland Paris that I've been planning for a very long time with a very good friend of mine and her little girl, which essentially is my niece because that's how it works in my friend group. Now, for my friend, it's her very first time visiting a Disney park, and that made me think of all the little stuff that noticed throughout the years. And of course, I kind of have a different perspective on things because I pay attention to stuff like theming and storytelling and stuff like that. And I've always done that. So all the little stuff I noticed, and I started thinking about, okay, well, where would this come from? Because, theme parks as a concept, um, as we know them today, how we define them today, are really not that old. So as I grew up and started looking into this stuff, it turns out that Walt Disney himself thought of a lot of these things. So I thought it'd be nice to kind of do not exactly a ranking, but just like, a top 10 of things that I found that I thought are really cool that I feel like more people should know about where they originate from. So that's what we're going to be doing. Now let's start at the beginning and start at theme parks as a whole. Now, where theme parks came from is honestly more or less Walt Disney's brainchild, especially in the States. So, of course, there were things like amusement parks or little areas with some rides. You had a merry-go-round and things like that, smaller things where parents could essentially sit on a bench, maybe have a snack. It'd be dirty, it wouldn't be well maintained. Parents would be bored and just wait until their kids are done playing. Now, this did not fly for old man Walt, so he decided I can do better. So, the whole idea of creating a theme park, or an amusement park probably originally, that would be fun for the whole family, so children and adults, that is something that started right there in one of those dirty little attraction areas aimed at kids with Walt. So, that's the first thing. Okay, great. So now we have the idea for an amusement park that appeals to people of all ages. How is this thing supposed to look? How should it work? Well, there's a couple things that Walt Disney thought of that he wanted to create this whole atmosphere of it doesn't matter where you are in the park, but you are within that area where everything is great, everything is clean, everything works, um, and just an overall feeling of everything's okay here. Now, Walt himself was from Middle America, so he liked the whole vibe of like Old Town America, things like that, and you see that in Main Street, for example. So he wanted to bring that feeling back, that carefree feeling. It's a small town, and everything is great. Nothing bad can happen to you here. Now, in order to get that whole idea across, there's a couple of things that he came up with. The first thing is something called the berm. So around the park, there's a berm, which is essentially a raised area of land, which closes off the whole park area. So you can't really see outside, which immediately ties into the next thing, which are sight lines, which is that no matter where you are in the park, if you're on a ride or not, or whatever, you can look out across the park, of course, but you can't see anything that happens on the outside. So you're really in this little world. Now, this immediately brings us to the next parts or ideas or design ideas that Disney had. Because in order for this whole berm and sightline issue to work, you need to sort of control where people go and how they move throughout a park. So, one of the big things that he thought of was the hub and spoke model. Now, I spoke about this briefly in the episode where we talked about everything new coming to Walt Disney Studios, which is to be Disney Adventure World. because that currently does not have a hub and spoke model. But when it reopens as Disney Adventure World, it will. So what is the hub and spoke model? That is that there's a central spot, and from there you can reach all the different lands. And what's different in this park that not all parks that have adopted the hub and spoke model have is that you can also move in between neighboring lands without having to go back to the central area first. So that's the hub and spoke model. That is something that Disney thought of as well because he thought it would be an easy way for people to figure out where they are, where they want to go next, and so on and so forth. Immediately related to this is the idea of the weenie. Now, what is a weenie? Why is it called a weenie? A weenie is something that catches people's attention. Much like if you have a weenie, a dog will always focus on where you have the weenie. What is the function of a proverbial weenie in a theme park? It's to make sure that people have an anchor point, they know where they're going, they know where they are, and it can draw people deeper into the park. The way Walt Disney wanted it to work is that no matter where you are in the park, you can always see the weenie. Now, in the Disney parks, especially if you look at, the first park and the castle parks that have opened since then, is obviously the castle right smack dab in the middle of the park. That is each park's weenie. Now, other parks obviously have other weenies. So, for example, in Walt Disney World, you have Epcot, and over there, the weenie is very clearly Spaceship Earth, which is the big globe thing in the middle that they also have in Europa Park that is something else for some reason. Something interesting to note here for us here in Europe is that the Walt Disney Studios currently don't really have a weenie. So there is, of course, the Eiffel Tower at the beginning of the park. But exactly that, it's in the beginning of the park and it's not in the middle, so it doesn't really function as a weenie the same way that the castle does. Now, once it reopens as Disney Adventure World, we are going to have some other tall structures. So right now, one of the bigger things is going to be Arendelle Castle, which is going to be right around Adventure Bay. And then later on, as we get the Lion King land, that's going to be even taller than what we now are getting in Frozen Land. So that will be the highest point of the park. Not sure if that's going to function as a weenie because, again, it's kind of on the edge of the park, but, we'll see what happens. From the current park map or the concept art of the park map that we have, when it does turn into a hub and spoke model, the hub is going to be the lake, is going to be Adventure Bay. So not sure how that's going to function as a weenie, but we shall see. By the time it reopens, we'll revisit it. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to park design, stuff that Walt Disney thought of, is the idea of a single entrance. Now, at the time when Disneyland first opened, the one in California, obviously, most amusement parks had more than one entry point. You could essentially come in from different angles depending on where you park the car, from which direction you're coming, which road you're taking, which highway you're taking, stuff like that. But Disneyland or Walt Disney said, this is Disneyland and we only have one single way to enter the park. This is, of course, to also build the experience and make sure that people step into the world the way he imagined they would. But people at the time thought, well, this is insane. But as you can see, most of the amusement parks and theme parks that we now have adopted this idea. Not all, but most. Now that we talked about the stuff that Walt Disney thought of in terms of design for a theme park, I want to move into the rides area. Now, before we go into all the different examples I have here, let me be very clear that a lot of the stuff that, has been revolutionary in the theme park world that came out of the Disney catalog was often thought of by Imagineers. That's the engineers that Disney employs to build all these rides. However, when the first park opened, they didn't have theme park engineers. So Disney pulled some people off of the storytelling team, the people who were making the movies and the shorts and the things, who were great at telling stories, and turned them into designers for the park, which is why we have so many well thought out storylines behind these different lands and areas and things that we have in the Disney parks. So this affected the park and the way it's structured in a number of ways, which is also why when we go back to our very first point of Walt Disney coming up with theme parks, this is how that came about. So this is kind of, how that comes full circle. So Let's talk about how rides were designed and what Walt's ideas were that we now see in theme parks and even some amusement parks throughout the world. Let's start all the way at the beginning. So, when Disneyland first opened, there were separate ticket books that you had to get. I'm condensing history here a little bit just for the sake of story, so bear with me. You had to purchase a ticket book to go on all these various rides. The rides were labeled A through E, so you had A, B, C, D, E types of rides, and you had the different tickets to go along with it. And the thing that remained from that time that we still use today is the term E ticket attraction. Now, you may have heard this at some point, maybe you haven't. If you've been going to theme parks or amusement parks a lot, you may have heard of this a lot. What is an e ticket ride? An e ticket attraction, it's kind of an umbrella term for very big, thrilling rides, the must do's when you go to a theme park. So at the time, we had stuff like, Pirates of the Caribbean or Big Thunder Mountain. Those were definitely the e tickets. Looking at Disneyland Paris, then the last e ticket attraction that we got is the one that saved the park, which is Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon. And yes, that's the last time we got a brand new ride with its own new dedicated building that wasn't a refurb. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. So, how do we recognize an e ticket today? Well, first of all, when they're built, they're usually started off with a massive budget. The theming is done very well. They use the latest technology, and sometimes it's even sort of the center point of an all new land. So, for example, what we're now seeing with World of Frozen. While I'm not sure it's technically been adopted by other theme parks, I do know that, like, colloquially, a lot of theme park fans do use it for any type of ride, e ticket type ride in different parks. Now, we briefly touched on it, but something else that Walt Disney came up with is, we talked about, the theming and things like that, but to structure this in a way where you have themed lands within a park, themed areas. So, like in Paris, we have Frontierland, Adventureland, Discoveryland, things like that. Main Street, obviously, you know, that we talked about earlier. That was kind of Walt's vibe. So, that idea, those themed lands, that's something that came from Walt Disney. Now, while we're on the topic of theming, something that Disney does very well and that people have noticed and has even turned into kind of a like there's a circle, there are certain circles online that kind of, go hard for this stuff. So, one thing that I wanted to bring up that again, Walt Disney sort of pioneered here are trash cans. Yeah, and there are a couple of things about these trash cans that came from Walt, and I want to sort of list all of them, honestly. So it all started with when he said he was going to build an amusement park, something that he has told people, something that he has mentioned, something that he has said, is that his wife's immediate response was, "Well, why? They're always so dirty." And he said, "My park won't be." That's something that we touched on earlier in the episode as well, right? So one of the things he did was come up with this idea of controlled cleanliness. Now, this is something that has evolved a bunch over the years, but I want to start with how it all started way in the beginning when he first opened Disneyland in California. Now, the story goes he entered Main Street, he bought a hot dog at the first hot dog cart that he came across, and he just kept walking across Main Street as he was eating his little sandwich. By the time he had finished his sandwich, he thought, okay, so this is where we need a trash can. That took him about 30 feet. So for those of us that don't use feet, the majority of the world, it's 9 meters and change. So right now, in all the Disney parks, you will always find trash cans no more than 30 feet apart. That is something that Walt Disney sort of thought up. I use this in my classes. So for those of you that don't know, like in my day job, I'm a teacher. And when I explain design thinking, this is how it started. This was design thinking before it was design thinking. Trial and error, prototyping, and seeing what works and what doesn't, and improving on that process. One of the iterations that they did on this trash can is, for one, the theming. So you'll notice, if you go throughout the Disney park, you'll see that whatever land you're in, the trash cans are themed accordingly. They're at least themed to the land. They could even be themed to a ride that you're on. If the trash can is, you come across it while you're in the queue for a ride. So that is also something that came from that idea of making sure that everything is controlled and clean. A big part of making it controlled is make sure that, it's not an eyesore. You don't want this big green or gray bin somewhere in the middle of a walkway where people can, see it and it kind of disturbs the magic. They can trip over it. It's an eyesore, really. You don't want any of that. Like trash is as inconvenient as it gets, and we don't want to draw any more attention to it, so we want to make it blend in with the environment. That was the idea. Now, what else do you need in order to make sure that nobody's bothered by trash or taken out of the whole magic bubble by trash? Making sure that you can't see other people's trash. So, you know how all those trash cans have like this swinging lid now? Okay, that is something that Walt Disney came up with. This is something that was surprising to me, and also I found it really awesome that nobody had thought of that before. But the idea is that you can throw in your trash, you don't see other people's trash, you're not taken out of the whole magic of you're in Disneyland and everything's okay here and nothing's gross because you can't see other people's trash. And Walt Disney did not patent this idea. So, other parks and other owners of other parks saw it and ran with it because now you have that everywhere. Because apart from the whole idea of, it doesn't disrupt your bubble that you're in, it's also just a lot cleaner because honestly, there are some parks where they don't do this, and especially in the summer, there are wasps everywhere. It's so annoying. So honestly, you know, this is a big one, and it's something you don't think about until you don't have it. You know what I mean? So we have Walt to thank for that. Now, I mentioned the cues a little bit earlier, right? Okay, so one thing that Walt Disney also thought up were the switchback cues, which by now are completely hated. But at the time, the idea was that once you're in a switchback cue, which means you kind of go back and forth in this S shape, like this snake shape, right? Is because you keep seeing the same people over and over, you'll start socializing and interacting with them and kind of like, making the time go by quicker. Of course, in reality, people don't really talk to strangers, at least not now. So that didn't really work. So that evolved into an interactive queue later on, where the queue becomes a part of the ride or at least part of the experience. And one of my favorite ones was always, I think I've mentioned this before probably, but in the Aerosmith Rock and Roller Coaster, that the entire queue, yes, it was a switchback, but you move through this made up record label area. So you move through the lobby and then you pass by all these collectibles and then you go into the recording studio, and it was a whole thing. And that becomes part of the experience. So nowadays, of course, we see switchback queues everywhere, even at the airport and at banks. And, if you still have a physical bank that you go to, I haven't been in years. So, but apparently they do have them there. The one thing I can think of are airports. When you go, like when you have to go through security and you go through this switchback with all these people kind of moving like one step at a time and waiting until you have to go through the machine. And anyway, let's not get into it. I don't have a good association with switchback queues, is kind of my point. But the original idea was meant for interaction and to have it be part of a positive experience. So I guess the intention counts or whatever. Of course, from a practical perspective, you could also just fit more people into a smaller space than if you would have like one very long queue. So, it's practical too, I guess. Now, one of the bigger ones, and that already edges on kind of, what Imagineers really did, but it started off as an idea from Walt Disney himself. So, audio animatronics. Now, Disney, when he was alive, was always very much about adopting new technology, and if it didn't exist, let's go figure it out how to make this happen. One of the biggest things that came out of this way of thinking were audio animatronics. Now, of course, when it came to movie making, Disney was already the first one to kind of successfully do the whole synchronized sound for animated movies, animated shorts in this case. So, in that sense, bringing that to a theme park was not so far removed from his imagination, but technically it was a big deal. This was, of course, because apart from, having to have something that moves kind of fluently, almost human like, it also needs to make sound. And that means that facial expressions, the way the mouth moves, things like that also need to move accordingly, which is, pretty tricky, especially, with current day technology, sure. But at the time, it didn't exist at all. So somebody had to figure out a way to do this. Now, this, of course, sort of came to be when a bunch of money was injected into the Walt Disney Company to develop stuff for the World Fair. This is something we've never really discussed in detail. However, if that's something that you're interested in, please do let me know. Drop me an email or leave a comment somewhere, and then I can get into that because honestly, it's super interesting. And Disney's work on World Fair type of things really brought us a lot of attractions that are considered classics to this day that they still have in the parks. So we can get into it. Let me know if that would be interesting to you. Anyway, what you need to know for the purposes of this episode is that this was first used in Disney's, Hall of Presidents, where they started with Abe Lincoln, where he was talking and things like that, kind of recreating this historical moment, making sure that they could find, the correct audio to make it sound like Lincoln. It was a whole thing. It was a whole endeavor because, how are you going to do that when nobody alive at the time was there when it happened? Anyway, like I said, we're not going to get into that now because really that's an episode in and of itself. Now, this day and age, of course, we still have audio animatronics and the movements are becoming more fluent, more human like, and it's looking great. I think that, the animatronics that we're going to be getting in World of Frozen are honestly going to be some of the best audio animatronics that Disney has ever made at this point. What they do in some cases is that instead of the facial expressions and things like that, they work with projections, which is something, we talked about that before as well. You can see that, for example, in Buzz Lightyear's Laser Blast, the Buzz Lightyear that's there explaining what we're going to be doing and defeating Zurg and all that, that's done with projections. And honestly, it looks less good than just an actual audio animatronic. So I'm excited to see these ones. Of course, in the meantime, this hasn't been standing still, and Disney has been moving into the area of, robotics and something they call stuntronics. So you can see this in some of the documentaries they do on Imagineering and things like that, where they have robots and things just performing crazy stunts, all controlled by, somebody behind the switches who's doing all that to this character. But it looks amazing. Like the technological advancements that we've seen since that first audio animatronic, I think Walt Disney would be so happy about this stuff. So yeah, I'm kind of excited to see what all that's going to bring. In terms of robotics, we're going to be seeing in Disneyland Paris, I think they're just visiting here, but there are these free roaming robots that they presented a while back um, that are going to be walking around, Star Wars themed areas in the Disney parks, and we're going to get at least a visit from them in Paris as well. I'm not entirely clear on the details, so if you know more about it, do let me know. I also just don't want to digress too much from the main topic here because the point is audio animatronics and everything it has brought us since. So even the free roaming robots, all of that started with that idea from Walt Disney himself. Now, the very last thing I want to mention that came from the brain of Walt Disney that we now still see in current Disney parks, in other theme parks, are the cast members. Now, we might not know them by this specific name in other parks, in non-Disney parks, but the idea that, the people who work in a theme park are part of the experience and they're playing along, they're playing a character, they're playing a part, they are on stage, if you will, they are part of the cast of this whole experience. That idea also came from Walt. Now, again, they don't necessarily have to be called cast members somewhere else, but it's small things like them being part of the story, like we now see with Danse Macabre in the Efteling, or them wearing themed outfits depending on which area of the park they're in. We see that in essentially all theme parks. This is also something that came from Walt. Now, the idea of, their level of service and things like that, that is something that has been so deeply embedded in the organization because that whole idea of you're a cast member and you're playing a part in, our guests' experience in the park. You're helping them create this wonderful memory, this wonderful day. That is kind of the bedrock of Disney customer experience management. And I really think it set kind of the tone, or it set a standard for not just for Disney, but for theme parks in general. Like if you want to do well, this is what you need to top. And I think that's probably one of the more important things in the theme park as well, because honestly, your day can be ruined by just unhelpful, cranky staff. And then a special shout out for Disneyland Paris because I know it gets some hate when compared to the American parks, but that's also because, Europeans and France in particular handle customer service a little differently. Like the whole client or customer is king thing is very different here compared to the US. And honestly, rightfully so in a lot of cases. But of course, that also, if you come here as an American, it might be a little bit jarring. But honestly, I have not had bad experiences with cast members in Disneyland Paris ever. Matter of fact, I can name a couple of encounters that just made the whole trip better and more fun, especially the fun part, because, they can be very much into their role, into their character, but also just the way that all these cast members kind of, if you approach them in a friendly manner and respectfully, they will go the extra mile for you. That's just, part of, yes, the Disney experience and everything, but also in Paris. And I would like to sort of, the people who complain about the customer service level in Paris, especially when compared to the American parks, I kind of want to know, or I probably don't, but kind of take a look at how you approach these people as well, right? Anyway, once again, I digress. I just want to make sure that everybody understands, like, honestly, these people can really elevate your experience, and they often do as long as you're like a kind, normal human being to them as well. Right. So, all of that, what have we learned today? So, there's a bunch of things that Walt Disney sort of started with that we now consider standard in theme parks. First of all, the idea of theme parks is something that started with Walt. Then, moving over to theme park design, something that came from Walt's brain, sightlines and the berm that helped keep the sightlines in order to make sure that you don't ever have to, at least in your experience, don't have to leave the bubble. Then the hub and spoke model, where we have something central that kind of anchors the park, and from there you can go and explore in different directions. This anchor that we talked about is also known as a weenie, which is another concept that came from Walt that has been used in every consecutive Disney park since. And I can't really speak to like how many other parks have used it, but there are definitely some points of recognition that you have in different parks, except that, it's not always exactly in the middle of the park. So the ones that do a hub and spoke model and do it well do have it, but again, not all. Then finally, when it comes to design, the idea of a single entrance, the concept of a single entrance, there's only one way to get in and out of the park. That is something that also started with Disneyland. Moving into the rides that come with a theme park, that should always come with a theme park. Some of the stuff that we've learned today is we talked about A and E ticket rides, or at least A through E ticket rides, specifically E ticket attractions, what that means and what that means today. We talked about theming entire theme park lands so that, you have a different experience no matter where you are in the park. From there, we move to how to handle trash, how to manage people's trash. So the idea of, the trash bins, what do they look like? How do they blend in with the environment? What are some innovations that we see there that you only notice when it's done wrong? Then we talked about switchback queues and how the idea for that was to have an interactive queue and how that evolved into making the queue part of the ride. And then we talked about, of course, audio animatronics and the developments that we're seeing now. And as a very big bonus, after these 10 points that we just discussed, we also talked about cast members and how they are present in the park and how they shape your experience there. So, this whole list of things is all stuff that started off in Walt Disney's brain that we still benefit from today. And some of these are more tangible in theme parks specifically, like, for example, the audio animatronics and things like that. But some stuff like the trash cans, I know, I'm very excited about the trash cans, is something that we find essentially all over the world with the lid and the thing and the so all in all, they say there's always kind of this whole discussion about art imitates life or life imitates art. And I think we see a nice blend of it right here. So all that being said, I hope you learned something today. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please share this episode with somebody who also might find it interesting, because that's how podcasts get discovered. Make sure that you leave a rating or a review in whatever podcast player you're using to listen to this. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. While I have you, make sure you also follow along on Instagram so you don't miss any of the stuff that I actually post from the parks, because I'm hoping to post some stuff about, how the Studios Park is looking right now. I'm going to share some stuff about the music festival that's currently going on, and of course, a bunch of snacks, because snacks are important to me and they should be to you. So, all that being said, I'm going to thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.